Origins of a Warrior, the boy who became a Gurkha, December 1917. High in the rugged hills of Nepal, where narrow mountain paths twist through terraced fields and mist drifts slowly across the valleys, a boy was born in a small village called Dakhani. The world beyond those mountains was at war. Europe had been burning for 3 years in what historians would later call World War I. But in villages like Dakhani, the war felt distant and unreal. Life there moved at the rhythm of farming season, monsoon rains, and the daily struggle to survive. The boy's name was Lachhiman Gurung. His father was a farmer, like nearly every man in the village. The land they worked was small and rocky, carved into steep terraces along the mountainside. Each year they planted rice, millet, and corn, hoping the harvest would be enough to feed the family. Sometimes it was, often it wasn't. Life in rural Nepal during the early 20th century was brutally simple. Families woke before sunrise, worked the fields until dusk, and measured success not by wealth but by whether there was enough food for the winter. For young boys like Lachhiman, childhood ended early. By the time he could walk the mountain trails alone, he was already helping carry water, herd animals, and work the fields. There were few schools, few opportunities, few ways to escape poverty, but there was one path that many young Nepalese men dreamed about: the Gurkhas. For over a century, soldiers from Nepal had served in the British Army. Ever since the fierce fighting of the Anglo-Nepalese War in the early 1800s, British commanders had developed a deep respect for the mountain warriors who fought them so fiercely. Instead of remaining enemies, they became allies. And from that alliance came one of the most legendary military forces in the world, the Gurkhas. These soldiers gained a reputation that echoed across battlefields from India to Europe. They were fearless, disciplined, relentless in combat. Every Gurkha carried a weapon that symbolized that reputation: the curved kukri knife. The kukri was more than just a tool or a weapon. It was part of Gurkha identity. Stories spread throughout Nepal of Gurkha warriors who had fought bravely in distant lands: Afghanistan, France, Gallipoli, and the jungles of Asia. Many returned home decorated with medals, respected by their communities. Some never returned at all, but even those sacrifices added to the legend. In villages like Dakhani, boys grew up hearing these stories around evening fires, tales of courage, of impossible battles, of Gurkhas standing their ground against overwhelming odds. And always the same motto echoed through those stories: better to die than be a coward. For Lachhiman Gurung, those words were not just a slogan, they became a dream. The dream of becoming a Gurkha. By the time Lachhiman reached his teenage years, the world was once again moving toward war. In Europe, tensions were rising. In Asia, the Japanese Empire was expanding aggressively across the Pacific. And by 1939, the world would plunge into another global conflict: World War II. For the British Empire, this war created an enormous demand for soldiers. Across India and Nepal, recruitment stations opened to enlist men willing to fight. Thousands volunteered. Among them was a young man from Dakhani. But Lachhiman Gurung faced a problem before he even arrived at the recruitment center. He was too small. The minimum height requirement to join the Gurkhas was 4 feet. Lachhiman stood 4 feet 11 inches tall. Under normal circumstances, that single inch would have ended his dream immediately. No exceptions, no negotiations. The British Army had strict standards, but the year was 1940 and the world was changing quickly. Germany had already conquered much of Europe under Adolf Hitler. Britain stood nearly alone against the Axis powers. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was preparing for massive expansion. The British needed soldiers, thousands of them. So quietly, without much announcement, some of the recruitment rules were relaxed. And that small change would alter history. The cigarette story there is a story often told about how Lachhiman Gurung joined the army. Some historians believe it may be partly legend, but like many stories about soldiers, it carries a deeper truth. According to the tale, one day Lachhiman's father sent him to the village shop to buy cigarettes. It was a simple errand, nothing unusual, but along the way Lachhiman encountered a friend who was traveling to the nearest recruitment station to enlist in the army. They began talking. The conversation grew longer. Excitement built. Adventure called. By the end of that conversation, Lachhiman made a decision he would go to. The two young men continued walking down the mountain trail together toward the recruitment center, and Lachhiman never returned home that day. 5 years later, when he finally came back to Dakani, he was missing an eye and most of his right hand. Instead of cigarettes, he brought home a story of war, and a medal that represented one of the greatest acts of courage in military history. Whether the cigarette story is completely true or not, one thing is certain. In December 1940, Lachhiman Gurung officially enlisted in the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, one of the most respected units in the British Indian Army. He was just 23 years old. Training a Gurkha joining the Gurkhas was only the beginning. The real challenge came next. Training. Gurkha recruits faced a program designed to transform farmers and villagers into elite soldiers capable of fighting anywhere in the world. They learned discipline, they learned tactics, and most importantly, they learned how to fight in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Jungle warfare, mountain warfare, close combat. They trained with the legendary Lee-Enfield rifle, the standard British infantry weapon of the time. The rifle was powerful, accurate, and deadly in skilled hands, but it required precision and practice. Every soldier learned to fire, reload, and maintain it flawlessly. For Gurkhas, marksmanship was a point of pride. They also trained with their kukri knives, mastering the techniques passed down through generations of warriors. British officers who commanded Gurkha units quickly discovered something unique about their soldiers. These men rarely complained. They marched longer, endured harsher conditions, and when combat began, they fought with a level of determination that astonished allies and enemies alike. German soldiers during both world wars came to fear facing Gurkha units. Japanese soldiers in Asia would soon learn the same lesson. But none of those enemies had yet encountered a quiet young rifleman from Dakani who stood just under 5 feet tall. At that point, Lachhiman Gurung was simply another recruit, another soldier in training. No one could have imagined that within 5 years he would extraordinary battlefield actions of the entire war. The war comes to Asia while Gurung trained. The war expanded rapidly. In December 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at attack on Pearl Harbor. Within months, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia. They captured Hong Kong, they conquered Malaya, they destroyed British naval power in the region. And by early 1942, Japanese armies invaded Burma. Burma was strategically critical. If Japan controlled it, they could threaten it and cut off supply routes to China, so the Allies fought desperately to hold the region. But the early campaigns went badly. British and Indian forces were pushed back through the jungle in chaotic retreats. Thousands of soldiers died from combat, disease, and starvation. Burma became one of the most brutal theaters of war anywhere in the world, and eventually Lachhiman Gurung's battalion would be sent directly into that nightmare. The jungles of Burma were unlike anything most soldiers had experienced. Thick vegetation blocked sunlight, monsoon rains flooded roads and trenches, malaria and dysentery killed thousands. Visibility was often limited to just a few yards. Battles happened suddenly and violently at extremely close range. Ambush, bayonet charges, knife fights in the dark. It was a kind of warfare that demanded courage, endurance, and relentless aggression. Exactly the qualities that Gurkha soldiers were known for. By 1944, the tide of war had begun to shift. Allied forces started pushing the Japanese army back through Burma. But the fighting remained savage, and soon Lachhiman Gurung would find himself standing at the very edge of the British defensive line during one of the most desperate attacks of the entire campaign. A battle where survival would depend on a single man refusing to give up. A battle that would begin in darkness, with the sound of grenades falling into a muddy trench, and with a young Gurkha rifleman who refused to die. By 1940, the war in Asia had reached a turning point. For nearly 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Army had dominated Southeast Asia. Their lightning offensives had captured vast territories, crushing British, American, Chinese, and Dutch forces across the region. Entire colonial armies had collapsed in weeks. Cities fell one after another: Singapore, Manila. Japanese commanders believed their soldiers were unstoppable, but deep inside the jungles of Burma, That belief was beginning to break. Allied forces were preparing a massive counteroffensive, and among the soldiers pushing back the Japanese advance were the Gurkhas of the 8th Gurkha Rifles. Among them was a quiet rifleman from Nepal, Lachhiman Gurung. At just 4 feet 11 inches tall, Gurung did not look like the kind of man who would become a battlefield legend, but appearances meant little in the jungles of Burma. In that war, survival depended on discipline, endurance, and the ability to fight relentlessly in the harshest environment imaginable. The hell of the Burma jungle, the Burma campaign, was one of the most brutal and exhausting campaigns of World War II. It was a war fought not only against an enemy army, but against nature itself. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense jungle stretched for hundreds of miles, broken by rivers, swamps, and steep jungle-covered hills. Visibility was often limited to just a few yards. A soldier could walk straight into an enemy patrol before realizing it was there. The climate made everything worse. During the monsoon season, rain fell almost constantly. Roads turned to rivers of mud. Rifles rusted, uniforms were dried, and disease spread quickly. Malaria, typhus. Many soldiers died without ever seeing the enemy. Those who survived lived in constant exhaustion, yet the Japanese army thrived in these conditions. Their soldiers were trained for jungle warfare. They moved silently through thick vegetation. They traveled light, carried minimal supplies, and often survived by foraging. But their most terrifying tactic was infiltration. Instead of attacking head-on like traditional armies, Japanese units often slipped through gaps in defensive lines during the night. They appeared suddenly behind enemy positions, cut supply routes, destroyed communication lines, and attacked from unexpected directions. It was warfare built on surprise, speed, and fear, and it worked at least at first. Gurkhas in combat, the Gurkhas quickly developed a reputation in Burma that rivaled their legendary status from earlier wars. Japanese soldiers learned that attacking Gurkha positions often ended badly. These Nepalese fighters were masters of jungle combat. They moved quietly, they held defensive lines with stubborn determination, and when the fighting turned close and brutal, they used their famous kukri knife with terrifying efficiency. British officers often said that Gurkhas possessed a unique combination of calm discipline and explosive aggression. In defense, they refused to retreat. In attack, they charged fiercely. Their regimental motto captured that spirit perfectly: better to die than be a coward. For soldiers like Lachhiman Gurung, those words were not just tradition. They were a code of life. The war turns by 1944, Allied commanders had reorganized their forces and prepared for a massive effort to push the Japanese out of Burma. The Japanese had stretched their supply lines too far. Their army was beginning to suffer shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. When Allied forces launched their counteroffensive, the fighting became relentless. Battles raged across jungle valleys and muddy hillsides. Artillery thundered through the forest. Aircraft roared overhead. Every mile gained cost lives, but slowly, steadily, the Japanese army began to retreat. One of the major Allied operations during this period was Operation Extended Capital. Its goal was simple in theory, but difficult in execution. Push south, central Burma. Destroy the Japanese army's ability to retreat in organized formations. For this plan to succeed, Allied units had to block escape routes. That meant holding jungle trails, river crossings, and strategic hills were often chosen for these missions, because when Gurkhas were ordered to hold ground, they held it. Moving toward victory by early 1945, the Japanese position in Burma was collapsing. Allied troops had crossed the mighty Irrawaddy River, a major geographic barrier that had once protected Japanese forces. Now the Allies were advancing toward Rangoon, the most important port city in Burma. Japanese units were retreating south, trying to escape the tightening Allied encirclement, but retreat did not mean surrender. Japanese soldiers were famous for refusing to give up. Even when surrounded, they often fought to the death. And during their retreat through the Burmese jungle, many Japanese units launched desperate attacks against any Allied force that blocked their path. These attacks were violent and unpredictable. Small Allied units could suddenly find themselves facing hundreds of Japanese soldiers determined to break through. That was exactly the situation facing the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles in May 1945. The order to block the escape on May 9, 1945, Gurung's battalion received new orders. Japanese troops were moving through a jungle region near the small Burmese village of Tongda. These soldiers were trying to escape south. Before Allied forces closed the trap, the Gurkhas were ordered to stop them. Their mission was clear: move into position, dig defensive trenches, block the jungle trails, and hold the line no matter what. For the Gurkhas, this kind of mission was familiar, but it was also extremely dangerous, because the Japanese would not simply surrender when they encountered resistance. They would attack, and they would attack hard. Digging in, the Gurkhas reached the area and began preparing positions. The terrain was difficult. Steep jungle-covered slopes overlooked narrow, muddy trails. Trees and thick vegetation limited visibility. Soldiers could see only a short distance in any direction. Perfect conditions for an ambush. The Gurkhas dug trenches into the hillside. Sandbags reinforced firing positions. Fields of fire were cleared through the jungle. Every soldier checked his ammunition. Every rifle was cleaned and ready. The men of C Company established a defensive designed to stop any Japanese force attempting to pass through the area. But one position stood apart from the rest. About 100 yards ahead of the main defensive line, a forward trench was dug. It was a small position, just large enough for 3 men. Its purpose was simple: provide early warning, slow down any enemy attack, give the rest of the company time to react. But that forward trench also carried enormous risk. If the Japanese attacked in force, the men there would be the first. They could easily be surrounded, cut off, overrun. Yet someone had to hold that position, and on that night in May 1945, one of those men was Lachhiman Gurung. The forward trench, Gurung and 2 other Gurkha soldiers moved into the forward trench. They improved the defenses as much as possible. The trench was deep and sandbags were stacked along the edges. Extra ammunition was placed within reach. Every man checked his Lee Enfield rifle carefully. Each rifle was loaded, each bayonet was ready. And like every Gurkha soldier, Gurung placed his kukri knife where he could reach it instantly. If the enemy reached the trench, the fight would become close and brutal. The kukri would decide it. The jungle around them was quiet, too quiet. Night slowly fell across the Burmese hills. Darkness in the jungle was absolute. Without moonlight, soldiers could barely see their own hands. Every sound carried through the tree. Creak. Distant birds, leaves moving in the wind. But sometimes those sounds meant something else. Enemy soldiers moving closer. Japanese troops were experts at night movement. They crawled through the jungle silently. Sometimes they waited just a few yards away from Allied positioning, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. The Gurkhas knew this, so they remained alert, rifles ready, eyes scanning the darkness, waiting. The enemy approaches somewhere out in the jungle that night. A large Japanese force was moving, at least 200 soldiers that were retreating through the forest, trying to escape the tightening Allied lines. But the Gurkhas were blocking the route, and the Japanese had only one option: break through. Their officers prepared a night assault. The plan was straightforward: approach silently through the jungle, throw grenades into the forward positions, then rush the trenches with overwhelming numbers. If the first line collapsed quickly, the rest of the defense might fall apart. For the Japanese soldiers, this was a desperate mission, but desperation often made them more dangerous. Many believed death in battle was preferable to retreat, so they advanced quietly through the jungle. Closer, toward the small trench where 3 Gurkha riflemen waited. Among them was Lachhiman Gurung. None of the men in that trench knew what was coming. They did not know that within hours, their position would become the center of one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in military history. They did not know that one man would soon stand alone against hundreds. And they certainly did not know that the battle about to begin would earn Lachhiman Gurung the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in the British Commonwealth. But the moment was approaching. The jungle grew silent. The air felt heavy, and somewhere in the darkness, Japanese soldiers raised their grenades. The jungle had gone silent again. Only the faint crackle of distant gunfire and the rustling of bamboo leaves moved. The humid darkness of Burma. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung lay in his shallow trench, barely 5 feet tall, exhausted, wounded, and almost alone. His left arm was shattered from the grenade blast. His right hand still gripped the rifle. The Japanese soldiers knew the trench was damaged. They believed the defenders must be weak now. And in the darkness, the soldiers of the Japanese army began moving forward again. Slowly, carefully, branches snapped in the jungle, footsteps approached through mud and leaves. Inside the trench, Gurung listened. His hearing had become his greatest weapon. Every small sound told him where the enemy was moving. Every shadow in the jungle hinted at another attack. Behind him lay the defensive line of the British Indian Army. If the Japanese broke through here, the entire position could collapse. There was no one else forward of him. The line depended on one wounded Gurkha rifleman, and Gurung refused to abandon his post. He pulled the bolt of his rifle back with one hand. Click! Another round slid into the chamber. In the darkness, a figure moved between trees. Gurung fired. The rifle cracked through the jungle. Made another shadow move closer. He fired again. The Japanese soldiers kept coming. They were determined to overrun the trench and break the defensive line. But every time they advanced, another precise rifle shot echoed through the jungle. Hours passed. The attack continued again and again through the night. Gurung's arm burned with pain. Blood soaked his uniform. Each movement was slower than the last, but his aim remained steady. Every time the attackers moved forward, he fired again. The defenders behind him could hear the single rifle firing again and again through the darkness. They believed the forward trench must still be fully manned. In reality, it was only one man, one wounded soldier refusing to retreat. By the early hours of morning, the jungle had grown quiet. The attackers had finally withdrawn. When daylight arrived, the other soldiers cautiously moved forward to check the trench. What they found shocked them. The trench was wrecked from grenade blasts. Mud and debris covered the position, and inside it sat Gurung, barely conscious. His destroyed arm wrapped in makeshift bandages, still holding his rifle. Around the trench lay the evidence of the night's battle. He had held the position alone against repeated attacks for hours. During one of the most desperate defensive actions of the Burma campaign of World War II. For his extraordinary courage, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. The citation described his actions simply: a single soldier grievously wounded who refused to give up his position and continued fighting until the enemy withdrew. But those words could never fully capture what happened in that muddy trench in Burma. A 27-year-old Gurkha rifleman, one functioning arm, one rifle, in a night that could have changed the entire battle. Instead, it became one of the most legendary acts of bravery in military history. Even decades later, the story of Lachhiman Gurung remains one of the greatest examples of the Gurkha fighting spirit, a spirit built on loyalty, courage, and an unbreakable sense of duty, because sometimes history does not turn on armies or generals. Sometimes it turns on one soldier who simply refuses to fall back. Morning light slowly spread across the hills of Burma. Mist rose from the wet ground as the soldiers of the British Indian Army carefully moved forward toward the destroyed trench at the front of the defensive line. All night they had heard the sound of a single rifle firing again and again in the darkness. Now the jungle was quiet. They expected the worst. When they reached the trench, the scene in front of them was almost unbelievable. The earthworks had been shattered by grenades. Mud, broken bamboo, and debris were scattered everywhere. And sitting inside the trench was the small figure of a Gurkha rifleman, barely conscious. His left arm was almost completely destroyed from the explosion. Blood had soaked through his uniform. His face was pale from hours of pain and exhaustion. Yet his rifle was still in his hand. That man was Lachhiman Gurung. Throughout the night, he had continued loading and firing his rifle with one hand, holding off wave after wave of attackers from the Imperial Japanese Army. When the battlefield was examined, the evidence of his stand became clear. Enemy soldiers lay scattered in front of the trench. They had tried again and again to overrun the position, and every time they advanced, Gurung had stopped them. One wounded soldier had held the most exposed point of the entire defensive line. Had that position fallen, Japanese troops could have broken through and attacked the rest of the battalion from behind, but the line never broke because one Gurkha refused post. After the battle, Gurung was evacuated for medical treatment. Doctors managed to save his life, but the damage to his arm was permanent. His injuries meant he could never return to active combat again. But his courage had already secured his place in history. For his extraordinary bravery during the Burma campaign of World War II, Lachhiman Gurung was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British Empire. The medal is given only for the most exceptional acts of bravery in the face of the enemy, and Gurung's actions were exactly that. His story quickly spread throughout the army, to the British officers who had witnessed the battle, to the soldiers who had heard the lone rifle firing through the night, and to the proud Gurkha regiments whose reputation for courage had once again been proven. The Gurkhas had long been known as some of the fiercest and most loyal soldiers in the world. Their battle cry was simple: better to die than to live a coward dog. That night in Burma, Lachhiman Gurung lived those words. Despite terrible wounds, despite overwhelming numbers, despite being completely alone, he refused to surrender his position. Years later, after the war had ended and the world had begun to rebuild, Gurung returned to his home in Nepal. He lived a quiet life far from the battlefields where his courage had become legend. Yet the story of that night in Burma continued to be told by soldiers and historians around the world, because in the vast history of World War II, filled with massive battles and powerful armies, sometimes the most powerful stories come from a single trench, a single rifle, and one soldier who simply refused to give up. The name of that soldier was Lachhiman Gurung, and his stand in the jungle remains one of the greatest examples of courage ever recorded in war. War eventually ended. In 1945, the guns of World War II finally fell silent across the world. Explosions slowly returned to their natural quiet, but some stories from that brutal war refused to disappear. One of those stories belonged to a small Gurkha rifleman named Lachhiman Gurung. After months of treatment for his terrible injuries, Gurung was discharged from the army. His left arm had been permanently disabled by the grenade blast that night in the Burmese jungle. For most soldiers, such wounds would mark the end of a difficult chapter. For Gurung, they became the marks of one of the most extraordinary acts of bravery ever recorded. He returned to his home village in Nepal, far from the battlefields where his name had become legend. There, he lived a simple life, surrounded by mountains, family, and the quiet rhythm of rural life. Yet, even in those peaceful hills, the memory of that night remained. The story of the lone Gurkha defending his trench had spread across the military world. Officers, historians, and soldiers continued to study the battle. Military accounts discussed the moment when a single wounded rifleman had stopped an entire enemy assault. His courage had saved the defensive line and perhaps many more lives. For that incredible stand, Gurung had been awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for bravery in the British Empire. The medal itself carried enormous weight. Only the most exceptional acts of courage in combat were recognized with the Victoria Cross. And Gurung's stand in the Burmese jungle had clearly earned it, even decades. After the war, veterans of the British Indian Army continued to speak about that night. Many of them remembered hearing a single rifle firing again and again through the darkness. They had believed an entire defensive squad must still be fighting. In truth, it had been only one man. One wounded Gurkha refusing to abandon his position. His story became a powerful symbol of the fighting spirit of the Gurkha soldiers whose bravery had earned them a legendary reputation around the world. For more than 2 centuries, Gurkha soldiers had served with distinction in the British Army. From the mountains of Nepal to the battlefields of Europe, Africa, and Asia, they had proven themselves again and again. And among those warriors, Lachhiman Gurung's stand remained one of the most extraordinary. In later years, Gurung occasionally attended military ceremonies honoring veterans of the war. Though quiet and humble, he was deeply respected by those who knew his story. To them, he was not just a decorated soldier, he was living proof of what courage truly looked like. When he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, tributes came from soldiers and historians across the world. The man who once defended a jungle trench with one functioning arm had become a symbol of bravery for generations. His medal, the Victoria Cross, remains a reminder of that night, a reminder that in war, the actions of one person can change the course of events, and sometimes history is written not by armies or generals, but by a single soldier who refuses to surrender. The name of that soldier was Lachhiman Gurung, and his story will never be forgotten.